Okay, I was asked to set the scene for what actually led to bush forever. And for those of you who have been involved in any part of a scientific endeavour, you would know, as Newton once said, that you stand on the shoulders of giants who have gone before you. No plan comes from nowhere, especially in a place like WA. And I wanted to say that in fact it has been. The reason it was done when it was done relates to the past history of the area. The first part, which I'll skim over briefly, is the Colonial Era. Although WA was settled in 1826, we're talking about Perth, we start in 1829. Initially, you can see from here that there was rather a slow development. There was, in fact, with some of the settlers, including Sir John Forrest, quite a considerable interest in the native flora and fauna of the state. And in fact, they set up a very large reserve in South Dandalup of some 64,000 hectares, which was gazetted in 1879. There was also a large push from the Australasian Association for the Advancement of Science to set up reserves in Western Australia, and there was certainly some legal protection started to occur for the establishment of reserves and the ability for government to actually set aside land as reserves. And compared to Europe, where all land is basically private, all land in Western Australia from the settlement was essentially governmental. So it's quite a major difference between the way reserves have been established in Australia compared to the Northern Hemisphere. The Muir Botanic Society, which then became the Royal Society, was established for people to talk about the science and publish. West Australian Museum started in 1891. We had some major colonial collectors, James Drummond, and we started to get people who knew things about the state, living in the state. The Flora of Australia was published in London, but really there were very little resources. Most of the expertise of knowledge was outside, and in fact there was little loss of bushland. So there wasn't a great push to do things. One of the things that was happening behind the scenes, unfortunately, of course, was the vast extinction that was going to occur with our medium-sized mammals. Even without clearing, we now are left with just a fraction of what was an incredibly diverse range of mammals, largely caused by the introduction of sheep grazing through the arid area, taking away the materials they lived on, and the introduction of foxes. So in fact, although it looked pretty jolly, there were some quite insidious things happening in the background. Once Australia was established, in fact we started to get in WA for the first 50 years of the 20th century a build-up of knowledge within the state to do things. The Western Australian Herbarium was formed. It basically formed in 1929. The Forest Department, which was the first department to look actively at conservation of flora and fauna in this state, was developed. And our state forest system, the only area really in the whole state, the only IBRA region, natural region, with a decent level of reservation, in fact was caused by the early conservators making sure that this land was kept for forestry and not released for agriculture. People these days forget just what an important aspect this establishment of the Forest Department was for conservation. There was the State Gardens Board set up, which became the National Parks Board. For NGOs, the Naturalist Club formed in 1921. And the first field guides to the flora started to appear, and that's a picture of Emily Pello's rather wonderful book put out in 1921 as the first major field guide to the flora. She then did a specific one on orchids, and the Gould League formed, so we started to get public education on natural environments. And the Naturalist Club started putting out their fauna guides in the 1950s, largely now taken over by the museum. So part of it, then we go into the 1950s and things really started to change. I've termed this one growth and loss because in fact, for example, the Wildflower Society formed. We got the introduction of the Blackall and Grieve keys, which for the first time meant that students and the public could actually get an idea of what an amazingly diverse flora we had. Soil maps came out on the coastal plain, so we were able to look at patterning of plants across the plain, which is dependent on soil. The Wildlife Protection Act came out in 1950, leading to eventually to the establishment of the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife to run national parks, and the general overall protection right throughout the state of wildlife, which does of course include everything. It's not just large furries, it's the entire wildlife. Kings Park and Botanic Gardens formed in 1961, which eventually gave me a job. The Academy of Science report, which is this one here, came out in 1963. a really important report about national parks and nature reserves throughout Western Australia, and one most people now would probably forget actually ever occurred, but it's the precursor of all the reports that have come subsequently. The Conservation Council formed in 1967 and Biological Survey commenced in the Fisheries and Wildlife Department in 1972 with the Goldfields reports. John Beard came to run the State Botanic Gardens, and he put out the descriptive catalogue, or edited the descriptive catalogue, which for the first time put all flora in what sort of soils it grew in and what sort of natural regions they grew in. So we started to get an appreciation of the fact that all flora wasn't everywhere. It actually was confined to various areas, various soil types. John started a vegetation survey because he didn't know where to grow things in the botanic gardens. He was an ecologist, he wanted to grow things from the Pilbara with things from the Pilbara, but he had no idea of what was happening and how the state was organised. So he decided to map the vegetation of the state. He told me when he got his award for the Order of Australia that if he'd have known what a job it was, he never would have commenced. But he did it. He actually mapped the entire state of Western Australia and gave us the basis for doing conservation planning. In 1974, Ray Specht, who was another plant ecologist, put out a 500-page report in the Australian Journal of Botany about conservation of plant communities in Australia. This then led to the concept of having nationally agreed to targets and the concept of having what's called comprehensive and adequate reserves, and representative reserves, a major change in policy and planning. And in fact, this also led, because he tried to work out what plants were rare, to the first Rare Flora report, which Neville Marchant and I did for the state in 1979. Also in the 1950s to the 1980s came out Sense of Place, probably the most important book that was ever produced on the Perth area. It was done by George Seddon, who was a polymath in many ways, but it's a book which talks about how he got a sense of place from living in Western Australia, living in Perth. For the first time it was done by someone who said when he went overseas he missed the place, he wanted to come back to somewhere that he felt at home with. And he felt at home with the subdued landscapes and the colours and the brightness of the climate. And it won many awards, and it probably is a major factor in the appreciation and growing appreciation of the place we live in. And it was a wonderful title because it still resonates today about a sense of place. Also during this period, the Conservation Through Reserves Committee was established by the EPA, which looked at the whole state in a series of 12 systems to look at the reserves that were available and potential through the whole state. At the same time, there was also this massive land releases occurring through the wheat belt, which are the northern sandplains, southern sandplains, the mallee and the Esperance sandplains, leading to a huge loss in, potentially huge loss in biodiversity without a great deal of planning. And I am sure that this event led to and got, and I know from reading through files, a lot of biologists very concerned and deciding that they had to get ahead of the game and start planning, doing reserve planning before such a major event occurred again. As I've said, the 1960s brought out the general soils of the coastal plain, and as everybody knows, soils and plants and a whole lot of other organisms all run together. So if you know the patterning of the soils, you generally know the patterning of the plants. So we now have got a system to actually put into a regional context where things grow on the plain, what sort of plants are. I'm talking mainly about plants, one, because I'm a botanist, but also you can map the rascals, so they just tend to be easier to do work for planning, conservation planning, and they're used as a surrogate. So in 1980, we hit 1980, and we really noticed there's getting to be a lot more people in the place, and there's a lot more work being done. The CTR System 6, which was the area which has Perth and the hills and the forests in it, came out in 1981. Everybody knew it was going to be the most difficult place to work on, and they were right. We also started getting things like rare flora surveys. We had the Flora of the Perth region come out. All of the land management conservation bodies were formed into CALM in 1984. As a person who was the last person on in Fisheries and Wildlife, the last employee, the formation of CALM actually was a very good thing. It meant that we had finally national parks, nature reserves, state forests were all under one body, all under a general plan to say these are managed essentially for conservation purposes, and all the other things fit into this overall scheme. So a very significant event. Forest management plans came out, the RFA, also quite a significant change within the general appreciation of what forests had become from what they originally were for. So as you can see, there's a lot of items there. This is in the published paper, but you can see an awful lot of data started appearing. What happened at the end of it was this data started to become available via digital sources, via the web. Flora Base, for example, in 1998. Up until then, all of this information was done pre-computer, basically, and pre the web system. So those of you who are much younger than me probably don't remember this, but it's certainly true that it is very important to make sure that you actually keep some of this stuff so you have an idea of where it's come from, what its quality is and where it's going. What happened at the same time was there was the clearing essentially faded away in the agricultural areas and started coming into the Perth region. As the Minister has said, there became a major expansion of Perth. Perth and the satellite area started growing, and there was a greatly increased amount of clearing started occurring on the coastal plain. This essentially led to doing both the 1983, the Conservation Reserves, the CTRC report, and Bush Forever to try and get ahead of the actual clearing that was occurring. Because I was involved in at least one study for the corridor plan where again we were trying to get ahead of the game, but it was not done as a whole of government report. A lot of the background work was done in conjunction with other people this is the floristic survey, the Swan Coastal Plain, which came out in 1995, which then meant that the EPA hired Bronwyn, my partner, to actually start implementing updates for System 6, because System 6 was having lots of issues. The RFA came out at the same time, and we started getting a much better appreciation of what was happening in the forest areas around Perth. Also in 1995, the Commonwealth, as I was saying, put the whole of Australia into biogeographic regions, of which the Swan Coastal Plain became one. So we started having a whole of Australia system for comprehensive and adequate reserve planning, and the IBRA system that was set up was done for this. Fortunately, for many reasons, Perth happens to sit in the middle of one of these. And it's actually a world-class natural environment. It's one of the world's 34 biodiversity hotspots. Australia itself is a megadiverse country, but southwestern Australia adds greatly to the megadiverse rating that Australia gets, with something like 5,000 or 6,000 native plant species, of which 80% are endemic to the southwest corner. We have the most diverse vascular plant flora of just about in the world, apart from the area around the Cape. And people forget this. They think the Biodiversity Hotspot was set up for all sorts of things, but basically it's for plants, so there. There's a high degree also within this Biodiversity Hotspot richness and species richness of the flora is not uniformly distributed. There is a considerable hotspot around Perth running up through the hills and the areas there. We frequently get 90 plus species along the edge of the scarp in 100 square metre quadrats, which in a world scale is truly incredible. So it's a hotspot within a hotspot as well. One thing Bush Forever didn't forget, however, and this is a community model based from our surveys, when we set up reserve networks, you've got to remember that surrogates are not real. You can have surrogates, but in fact each of the groups we survey requires a different sort of reserve to the others. And if you just set up reserves for one organism, you will fail. So you always need to keep in the background that although much of the planning is done on plants, it is always got to remember there are lots of other organisms out there that require their own particular things to be conserved. So you need habitat for bush birds and habitat for snails, and snails and bush birds have pretty different requirements. So if you're trying to set up Bush Forever, they were trying to do it for everything in a regional context. And the biodiversity on the plain, just for the plants itself, as you can see, is pretty amazing. Somewhere over 2,000 native plants, more than Tasmania, lots of rare communities, and an awful lot of rare plants because they're both naturally and rare, and also because they've become restricted. That led to the conservation plan, which is Bush Forever, which underlies all this data. And this data has taken a long while to get together, and is the reason why it came together at the time it did. It's aimed to stop this occurring, where you get to a stage where you actually have lost the capacity to keep the biodiversity you have, to try and get ahead of the game, so that with managing even in a fragmented landscape, we do try to keep all the fauna and flora we can by making sure we don't get to critical thresholds that happen. And I'll just give you a very brief example. Bush Forever, to me, despite all the hoo-ha you hear from international literature, is probably the most successful conservation plan ever undertaken in a metropolitan region throughout the world. And it was done internally without a huge amount of World Bank money that's happened in Africa and other places. We actually did it, and we should be jolly proud of it. In 1999, I looked at all the reserves on the coastal plain, and there were a whole lot of species. 15% of them were basically unreserved. But with Bush Forever came in, although we'd got a whole lot of extra species, we found, the number of unreserved had dropped from 261 to 115. And these were on really quite unusual habitats. And most of the unreserved ones were in fact in places which were flagged to go into Bush Forever but were not actually reserved. So Bush Forever's had a major change, caused major changes to the conservation status of our flora along the coastal plain. So implementing it in the next phase. There's been a lot of work done since it finished. WELGA, which you'll hear about today with the Perth Biodiversity Project. The Chewett Atlas came out in 2003 looking at a specific type on the coastal plain, the trout trees. There's been a continuing transfer of land, as the Minister said, into the conservation management, which has continued on. Swan Bioplan rose out of Bush Forever, and there's been a whole lot of quite detailed area reports done on places outside the area, the Witcher, the Busselton Plain, the Peel region have been finished. All the biological information files that were done for Bush Forever have now been archived at the DEC Library, and they're available as PDFs. And there's some pretty significant species level data sets. What needs to happen now is more of the local significant areas need to be brought in, because the major expansion of Perth is still happening. And so the big area of vegetation clearance probably throughout the state now is on the coastal plain. And if you look, for example, at the western suburbs, this is the western suburbs where I actually happen to live, and we did an analysis of the flora of the western suburbs. You will notice that the western suburbs, as far as we could work out, have 584 vascular plant species. In fact, 9 type collections of plants come from the western suburbs, including the earliest plants ever collected in Australia, done by Vlamming. They have 1 globally extinct species, a native thistle. There's 1 regionally extinct species, and 1 other one only got from Herdsman's Lake that seems to be regionally extinct. We noticed that of the historical records we could find from the old herbarium material, about 45 species seem to have disappeared from the western suburbs. So there have been a loss of habitat has caused those. Habitats of particular interest are in fact the Swan River, which is virtually unreserved. The northern bank of the Swan River appears to be a true refugia that contains flowering plant species and snails that are only known in the area from offshore islands. From this we can see that although Bush Forever will keep a certain amount of this, it's incredibly important that local areas are kept as well. So although we use surrogates, and they normally use them as it, normally it's vegetation, it can be species richness or it can be soils, we're still relatively unable to use the large amount of point data readily for modelling these. But we should remember to keep things like these guys in mind. They require very different habitats and very bigger linkages, and we also still know not a lot about our local flora. There's still an awful lot we've got to know. There's a heck of a job in trying to keep the very complex interrelation systems that our flora has within a reserve network. That will be a challenge. And we also have challenges now that we've got more and more data on genetics showing that we thought the biodiversity and the variation we had in our vascular flora was large. We were definitely right. It's actually even worse than that. This is a model, or actually a genetic distance of a group I did my PhD on, Lexmania. If you look at that, you'll notice that what has happened in the collie area, the 2 things that are close together there, one of them has the morphology of one, there's been an ancient hybridisation event. The Lexmania sessiliflora collie, in fact, has got the genotype of Lexmania ramosa from Perth in it, although it looks like the other one, and it now lives in the habitat that it couldn't occupy before because of that ancient hybridisation event. And one does wonder what else could be out there in the flora if we actually just did the detailed work required. Another one, Conosperm undulatum. There are hybrid swarms of undulatum all through Perth Airport, and dealing with some of these to try and keep them in the landscape, because this is what naturally occurred. There was a line of hybrids between Triplinervum and undulatum, all of which are pretty well disappearing. None of these are going to be left in another 20 or 30 years. So the conclusions, at the major levels, these are major clades, they just mean plants, animals, the whole kit and caboodle. We've got pretty good reserve networks. At the species level, however, and the local level, there's still some pretty major issues in attaining this adequate reserve network. We have lots of natural rarity. We use surrogates to set up a model, and there are major data deficiencies. We have very rapid species turnover in the state, which means it's hard to say if you get species here, you can predict that you'll get them there. So there's a lack of prediction, and there's still major taxonomic impediments in many groups, especially invertebrates. But the major thing that I've come to from reading all about the stuff, the major resource is people. Without a doubt, there have been a lot of people who spent an awful lot of time for very little reward over a very long period to conserve our natural bushland. Without those sorts of people, we would never have got to where we are today. And we do need to find ways and means of keeping more of the community involved to try and keep our bushland into the future. Because the acknowledgements, really, this is an acknowledgement slide to the vast number of people who've gone before me and everybody else to actually try to document and to conserve our flora. And may we get many more of them in the future.